There was a time when a different face carried the weight of a beloved character, before the charm, before the laughter, before the Delorean ever hit 88 miles per hour. The cameras were already rolling, the lines were being delivered, and yet something felt misaligned beneath the surface. Method acting clashed with light-hearted storytelling. Tensions brewed off camera as scenes meant to entertain became breeding grounds for discomfort. For 5 intense weeks, a vision was pursued, one that would quietly unravel under the weight of its own misfit energy. And then, almost silently, everything changed. A decision made not with anger, but with a deep and reluctant understanding. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with drama, but with a heavy pause between takes. What followed reshaped not just a character, but the heartbeat of an entire film. The cost was high, millions spent, scenes erased, trust rebuilt from scratch. But through that quiet turmoil came the birth of something greater. A choice that would ultimately give the story its true voice. Looking back, that moment feels like the invisible hinge that turned everything. Long before audiences ever laughed or cheered, there were scenes left on the cutting room floor and names nearly etched into history, only to fade into what could have been. Each frame of the final cut carries echoes of those early trials, soft and buried, but still there. A cast unsettled by unseen friction. A story trying to find its tone. Behind the curtain of every classic lies the reality of risk, change, and the pain of letting go. There was a phone number on a diner wall, a guitar amp sparking with impossible silence, and a glowing red liquid that defied science for the sake of wonder. These weren't just mistakes, they were fragments of a production still finding itself. Even the film's title stood on shaky ground, one email away from vanishing into something forgotten. And yet, against all odds, the pieces fell into place, not perfectly, but meaningfully. What emerged wasn't flawless, but it resonated. And that resonance, full of memory, of effort, of imperfect brilliance, still carries forward, frame by frame. Back then, it seemed like everything was already in motion. Eric Stoltz had been cast, the crew was deep into production, and the vision for Back to the Future was forming day by day. But something kept tugging at the edges, a quiet, growing realization that the tone was off. Stoltz, with his intense dedication and dramatic presence, never stepped out of character. His scenes were technically sound, but emotionally distant from the spirited energy the film quietly demanded. His method approach left fellow actors like Thomas F. Wilson walking on eggshells, especially as pretend fights edged too close to real conflict. The air on set grew heavier with each take, every punch choreographed but never fully pretend. There was no anger in his performance, but there was no levity either. The laughter written into the script rarely landed on set. The disconnect became undeniable. The dream of the film was still alive, but it was veering down a path it was never meant to take. And so, after 5 weeks of footage, effort, and hope, the crew had to begin again. Michael J. Fox stepped in quietly, carrying a completely different kind of energy, quick-witted, magnetic, effortlessly in tune with the rhythm of the story. What followed was not a clean slate, but a reset full of risk. The price was steep. $4 million vanished into reshoots, transforming the budget into something almost unmanageable for its time. Yet there was no other choice. Behind closed doors, Robert Zemeckis had to sit across from Stoltz and tell him the truth, a moment he would later call the hardest of his life. And even then, Stoltz remained in a strange limbo, unaware for days that the decision had already been made. Time didn't stop for reflection. The crew kept moving forward, slowly erasing a version of the film that would never be seen. In the middle of that chaos, technical slips began to appear. A diner scene meant to anchor the story with detail showed the wrong hand in close-up, aged and wrinkled, betraying the illusion of youth. In another scene, a television played a show that hadn't yet aired, off by nearly 2 months, but left in as if no one would notice. And the glowing red liquid passed off as plutonium flickered on screen, completely divorced from how such a substance truly exists. These weren't just errors. They were the fingerprints of a production trying to regain its balance while still pushing forward. Even the title, something that now feels iconic, was almost lost. Universal executive Sid Sheinberg couldn't see the appeal in Back to the Future and pushed for Spaceman from Pluto, a nod to a prank scene but far removed from the film's spirit. The clash between creative instinct and executive pressure threatened to undermine the very identity of the movie. But Steven Spielberg, with subtlety and grace, diffused the tension before it could take root. Still, the financial tug-of-war continued. The California Raisin Advisory Board paid to feature their product in a scene that never aired. The moment, meant to be playful, looked awkward and was pulled. What followed was the threat of legal action, later settled with a refund that closed the door on the issue. These behind-the-scenes frictions rarely make it into history books, but they shape the rhythm of a film more than most realize. Just like Huey Lewis, who initially resisted the call to write for the film, unsure of his fit. Yet in time, the power of love was born, simple, unplanned, and destined to become part of cinematic memory. The imperfections didn't stop there. A magazine out of place in Marty's room, a missed safety step in a guitar scene that defied real-world logic. Every detail mattered, and yet, some slipped through, quietly reminding us of the human hands behind the curtain. The casting journey could have gone in countless directions. Names like Johnny Depp, Charlie Sheen, and John Cusack passed through auditions. See, Thomas Howell nearly made it. But the path curved towards Stoltz, then pivoted again to Fox. Even Christopher Lloyd almost walked away, tired from years in the industry. But with persistence and care, the team brought him back, and the character of Doc Brown was born. Not from spectacle, but from subtle commitment. His height difference with Fox became part of the story, disguised through posture, not trickery. And the Delorean, a symbol now burned into pop culture, was never a guarantee. Studio pressure pushed for a Ford Mustang, but the filmmakers stood firm. A fridge was once in consideration, but safety concerns pulled it from the script. The final choice, though flawed and unreliable on set, became something unforgettable. What remained after all the shifts, the cuts, the tension and compromise, was a story that worked not despite its struggles, but because of them. Long after the recasting had settled and production regained its pace, the film continued to carry the weight of earlier decisions. What happened behind the scenes didn't just vanish. It lingered, quietly embedded in the final product, shaping every frame with its presence. There was a performance on screen and another behind the camera, a kind of quiet resilience stitched into the fabric of the film. Crispin Glover's absence from the sequels told its own story, one built not on scheduling or fatigue, but on conviction. Glover, deeply unsettled by the film's ending message that equated happiness with material wealth, refused to return. His disagreement wasn't loud, but it was unwavering. The studio, determined to maintain continuity, used a blend of old footage and a look-alike actor buried in prosthetics. The illusion held for the casual eye, but for Glover, the act felt like a theft of identity. He took the matter to court, and the outcome wasn't just a settlement, it was a reckoning. Behind that silent substitution was a warning. Creativity has its boundaries, and not every actor's image is a tool to be repurposed without consent. The tension in that moment stretched far beyond screen time. It became part of the film's shadow. Even the vehicles of the story held their own complications. The sleek Delorean, so central to the film's magic, became a source of constant frustration during production. Its futuristic appearance masked a deeply impractical machine, cramped, unreliable, and prone to stalling at the worst times. For Michael J. Fox, the space was unforgiving. Scenes demanded precision, but the car offered little room for movement. Doors that lifted with drama often came down too fast, colliding with the actor's head again and again. In one instance, that mishap was captured on camera and quietly left in the final cut, not as a joke, but as a detail too real to erase. What made the Delorean iconic also made it impossible to work with. The irony wasn't lost on the crew, but the alternative had once been worse. A refrigerator, proposed in early drafts, was wisely discarded out of concern that children might imitate dangerous behavior. The Delorean, for all its faults, became a symbol, less because it worked and more because it didn't. Every scene shot inside it was a challenge overcome, every take a small victory. Changes continued to ripple through the cast. Marty's girlfriend, Jennifer, was played by Claudia Wells in the original film, grounding the role with a sincerity that matched the tone. But life off-screen took precedence when her mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Wells stepped away quietly, without fanfare, and Elizabeth Shue stepped in. To audiences, it was a seamless transition, made with grace and minimal attention. But for Claudia, watching the sequels unfold without her was like drifting through a version of her own life where she no longer existed. She described the experience as out-of-body, disorienting. It wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a reminder of how quickly things shift in the world of film, how easily a role can pass on without closure. And yet, years later, she returned to fan events with warmth and appreciation, embracing the legacy she helped shape, even if she had to leave it behind too soon. That chapter may have closed quietly, but its imprint never faded. Even the dashboard of the time machine, so precise, so carefully designed, contained its own quiet oversight. When Marty races back to 1985 to save Doc Brown, he inputs a time just 10 minutes before the fateful moment. The logic holds, but the opportunity slips. He could have gone back further, given himself space to prepare, to warn, to change more. But in that small, overlooked choice lies a mirror to the film's own production, a world driven by quick decisions, emotional instinct, and deadlines that left little time for second-guessing. So much of the movie was built in real time, piece by piece, amid tension and compromise. Choices made under pressure became permanent parts of a cultural artifact. No one planned it perfectly. No one could. But somehow, those imperfect decisions layered together into something lasting. A story held together not by perfection, but by momentum. And that momentum, full of missed chances, recast faces, stubborn cars, and legal battles, became the very soul of Back to the Future. There were still details left behind, small fragments that never made it into the spotlight but linger quietly in the corners of the frame. A librarian's magazine, resting unnoticed in Marty's bedroom, suggested the set was dressed quickly, without close inspection. It was a minor oversight, but even that carries the feeling of a production pushing through long hours, solving one problem only to meet the next. The amplifier scene, dramatic and exaggerated, skips the basic rule every guitarist knows: never plug in with the amp already powered. But in this world, logic often gave way to style, and realism bowed to rhythm. These are mistakes meant to be ridiculed. They are the marks of people under pressure, working through long days, trying to build something lasting while still learning what it would become. For every carefully planned moment, there was one left to chance. These things weren't supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to work. And somehow, even when they didn't, they still did. Each time the film jumps between decades, it reminds the viewer that perspective changes everything. What felt wrong or misaligned in the moment often takes on new meaning in hindsight. The mismatched details, the casting changes, the legal tensions, none of them erased the heart of the story. If anything, they deepened it. The film's humor, its subtle nods to generational habits, and its blend of nostalgia and invention all became part of something layered and textured. The audience never saw the tired hands behind the scenes or the tension under the surface, but the feeling made it through. Sometimes through a joke. Sometimes through a glance. It's there when Marty picks up a guitar. It's there when Doc slouches just slightly to close the gap. These choices, intentional or not, became the film's signature, its quiet truth under the spectacle. They speak to the way stories are built, not only with vision, but with compromise. Years later, those who stepped away, whether by choice, by conflict, or by circumstance, still remain a part of it. Stoltz's version of Marty exists only in fragments, but those fragments helped shape the path. Claudia Wells' Jennifer lived only in one chapter, but that chapter held its own kind of clarity. Crispin Glover's absence didn't erase his mark, it only called attention to it. The Delorean never really worked the way it was supposed to, and yet it still carried everyone to where they needed to go. That tension between what was and what almost was echoes through the trilogy and through every rewatch. Not as flaws, but as fingerprints. The legacy of Back to the Future was never just in its plot, or its visuals, or even its unforgettable quotes. It lived in the moments where things didn't go as planned. It lived in the space between the lines, in the pauses, in the long nights when the right decision felt like the hardest one to make. The story never promised to be smooth. It only promised to be worth the ride. And it kept that promise frame by frame. Behind the glowing plutonium, behind the accidental bruises and replaced faces, behind every shift in cast or clash of vision, there was always a quiet persistence to finish what had been started. No single moment tells the full story, but together, they trace the outline of something rare, something that endured not because it was easy, but because it mattered. The chaos of its creation didn't stop its impact. If anything, it made it stronger. And now, decades later, the imperfections don't take away from the film's power. They make it feel alive. That journey, with all its turns, still resonates. That chapter may be over, but it shaped everything that came after. And it will always remain imperfect, unforgettable, and somehow exactly as it needed to be.